Nick right here with Zachary Fillingham, managing editor of Geopoliticalmonitor.com. And today we're going to talk about the decline of one of the world's most important water systems, the Indus Basin. So, Zach, this is a basin I'm not too familiar with. Tell us a bit about it and why it's important.
All right. Well, the Indus Basin is primarily important because of its geopolitical position or geographic position, insofar that it spans a very important region of the world, a very densely populated region of the world. It includes India, China, and Pakistan, which are three geopolitical heavyweights. The headwaters fall under the Tibetan Plateau, which is controlled by China. And then it flows through India and then mostly flows through Pakistan before draining in the Arabian Sea. That territory includes 237 million people who live there. It's a source of drinking water in a part of the world where fresh water is in very short supply. These are some of the most water-stressed countries in the world. It's a local economic driver in terms of fishing and agriculture. In the case of Pakistan, over 24 million people are engaged in agriculture as their primary economic activity, which accounts for 40% of the economically active population. So obviously, the health of this water system is an extremely important economic consideration, particularly in Pakistan, where the Indus flows through. So, and finally, the waters are used for hydropower stations to produce electricity. And again, in terms of Pakistan, this is an incredibly important consideration because Pakistan, as we all know, is has suffered from electricity shortages, which have bottlenecked its economic growth for a long time. So yes, for all these reasons, the Indus Basin and the river system that it feeds are extremely important for the South Asian countries it flows through.
And Zach, what are the factors that are impacting the water supply in the Indus Basin?
Okay, so some of the factors are old and kind of expected at this point. Basically, there's a lot of dam building that goes on in the Indus Basin and similar basins throughout Asia and throughout the world. The more dams that are built, the less volume, the weaker the flow is downstream. So we have a good map on the website. I recommend going checking it out because really, when you look at the map and you imagine it flowing downward from the Tibetan Plateau, you can see how the geography plays into the geopolitics of a river system like the Indus. Basically, the upstream country that controls the headwaters has the most leverage over downstream countries. The river system forms in China, flows downward through India, and then through Pakistan. So in that equation, Pakistan has the least amount of power. It basically has to accept whatever happens upstream in India and China. If China decides to dam heavily, then that will affect the flow not only in Pakistan but India as well. So basically, in Indus and other basins, you have a lot of dam building that has taken place. That has already affected flow in a big way, and it continues to proceed, right? There are still dams being built. In the case of Pakistan, there are two major dams being built or being planned right now. One's a 4,500 megawatt dam in Gilgit-Baltistan, and then there's another around 2,000 megawatt project that's going in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. So there's new dams, and there's also the problem of old dams that are aging over time. And as we know, Pakistan is a country. I'm going to mostly be talking about Pakistan here because most of the problem has to do with Pakistan, and Pakistan has the majority of the Indus system running through it. So most of Pakistan's dam infrastructure is aging over time. There's a lot of silt buildup because this river system is particularly silt heavy. So silt affects the reservoirs that were built before. It necessitates more maintenance and upgrading of pre-existing dams. And as we know from the various economic articles or economic focus articles that we've published on Pakistan of late, the government of Pakistan is grappling with its own variety of economic problems and cannot necessarily devote huge resources to upgrading and maintaining its dam infrastructure. So the end result is and the same applies for irrigation infrastructure. Pakistan's irrigation infrastructure is mostly colonial era. It's woefully inefficient, and it needs upgrading to deal with the new reality. And this leads into the newer impacts that are affecting the water system, and those all pertain to predictably climate change. So climate change can alter the water volume in a basin system in a variety of ways. It can shift established precipitation patterns that are basically like rendering certain irrigation systems null and void, creating sort of contingencies that planners are not prepared for. It can cause increased evaporation in reservoirs, so which again impacts these pre-existing irrigation systems, causes disruptions in water supply to farmers that can result in decreased production. And finally, which is primarily the focus of this latest article series on the Geopolitical Monitor, it can also melt glaciers as the temperature increases at higher altitudes. These glaciers that feed these extensive water systems, they begin to melt. And as they melt, the water actually increases. So flow increases because there's more water being produced as they melt. But we're going to get to a point, which is called peak water, where the glacier is melted, and it impacts volume in a sort of downward way. So there'll be less volume, and that adjustment will be permanent. So...
And to our listeners, I'm on the website now, Geopoliticalmonitor.com, looking at the map, and the article is Glacier Watch Indus Basin. You can check it out, and I'm looking at the river system flowing down to Pakistan.
Yeah, just one moment. We're going to do a series of articles on these basins because glacier melting and peak water is a problem that affects basins all over the world. And since climate change is different and the glaciers are different, so every basin has a different peak water point, and every basin has a different impact of how much glacier melt will affect downriver flow. And the Indus Basin is for example, the Indus Basin is one where glacier melt will have a high impact on downriver volume. But we're still a far way away from that peak water inflection point, which is expected around 2070. But as the article argues, and as we will find out in this podcast, the problems within the Indus Basin are already extensive. So as these future sort of glacier-related problems become more pronounced, we might move to a real crisis-type situation.
So, Zac, how bad are the water problems in Pakistan?
All right, so yeah, you might have come across an article in the past that had, some sort of hyperbolic description, ticking time bomb, disaster waiting to happen, those sort of things. And basically, when you look at all the various metrics about Pakistan's water crisis, it's kind of understandable. So I'm going to go through a list of just give a sense of what the water situation is like in Pakistan. So within Pakistan, within the national dam system reservoirs, Pakistan only has about 30 days worth of water storage capacity, which is very, very, very short span. Compared to India, India has 190 days worth of storage. And compared to the United States, the USA has 900 days of storage. So 30 days, obviously not a lot at all. And it makes Pakistan particularly susceptible to droughts and disruptions, as we were just discussing, potentially climate change related disruptions in weather patterns and distribution. So per capita availability in Pakistan, and this is like a sort of stark metric that gives you a sense of how quickly things are changing in terms of the water situation in Pakistan. So per capita water availability was 1,500 cubic meters per person in 2009. So that's about 10 years ago. Now it's 1,000, which is the IMF threshold for water scarcity. So basically per capita water availability has crossed the water scarcity point. And again, we can expect it to get worse over time. 83% of the water supplies in Sindh, which is the southern province of Karachi, are contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. In Karachi in particular, that number is 90%, so it's highly polluted. It's not trustworthy. It's not good fresh water. Pakistan has the highest intensity rate, which is water use per unit of GDP in the world. So the economy is highly inefficient, and it uses an extremely abnormally large amount of water to produce agriculture and manufacture outputs. Many of Pakistan's cities, actually, it's kind of interesting because Pakistan actually has had progress in terms of delivering water to its population, but most of that progress has been in the rural context. And Pakistan's cities are in particular struggling to produce or struggling to distribute fresh water to their growing populations. They have the double pressure of exploding population and decreased supply. So in this situation, and as I said before, there's not a lot of public money that's being invested into new water infrastructure. So you have water distribution that's being increasingly done by sort of ad hoc private tanker fleets. So like water trucks driving around Pakistan's municipalities, delivering water. Since they have to truck it in from increasingly further away, the water prices are high, and sometimes these water truck rackets are actually criminal. There's a whole bunch of racketeering that goes on. Sometimes you have black market racketeers who are siphoning off from public water systems and then selling it on the black market. And these criminal outfits are organized and armed to such a degree that they actually they represent a threat to Pakistan's municipal and national security services. This is all combining to create a lot of sort of local ground level tensions in terms of the civilian population and the government. The civilian population rightfully views the government as totally unable to provide what is a sort of basic element of human survival and fresh water. And finally, groundwater extraction in Pakistan's major aquifers is well over the rate of replacement, and the country is home to some of the most stressed underground reservoirs in the world. In particular, there's a large aquifer that spans the Indus Basin and is shared by both Pakistan and India, and most of the agricultural activity in that territory is a combination of overland irrigation systems, which would be fed from the Indus River systems, and underground reserves that are fed by these aquifers. Both are under extreme stress, and we're going to find that both will be bottlenecked in the future and increase and lead to basically less water for more people.
And what kind of conflicts can we expect to result from these water shortages?
All right, so like one of the reasons we're focusing on water on Geopolitical Monitor is because obviously it's a very important resource, and when you focus on these sort of key resources, they often lead to ethnic or sectarian competition and conflict within a country, and sometimes these causal connections are not very clear, right? Because you might have a situation where water is creating, as I alluded to before, tensions between civilian population and the government. Those tensions boil over in some sort of mass civil unrest. but it's not necessarily always going to be incredibly clear that it was this water shortage that caused it. Is just it created the circumstances for something to occur, right? I think a lot of people cite the protests in Syria as an example, and there have been sort of opinions on both sides of this debate. Some people agree with this, some people don't. But the argument is that there was climate change and water-related impacts on farming is what created the urbanization, is what created the initial protests, the initial Arab Spring protests that led ultimately to the Syrian civil war. So you have this sort of cascading effect that these environmental issues can have. So if we look at Pakistan in particular, it's a country with a lot of potential ethnic, national, intra-state sectarian competition. You have this sort of classical competition between the Sindhi population in the south, the Punjabi population in the east. You also have the Balochs in the west, who have basically have an ongoing insurgency going right now. There's various movements to try to establish Balochistan. And you also have the growth of Pashtun nationalism, the quote-unquote Pashtun Spring, that's basically unfolding right now and being cracked down on by the Pakistani army. So long story short, there are no shortage of potential fault lines for sectarian, ethnic, religious competition within Pakistan that these stressed resources, this competition for limited resources can cause to worsen. And obviously water is just one of these things. There's a lot of trends that are unfolding in Pakistan right now that are basically, it's not, there are a lot of factors that can drive these different groups into more fervent competition. There's water, jobs, no shortage, right? There's a lot of internal displacement, et cetera, et cetera. Like even, Belt and Road protests in Balochistan. But I digress. I don't want to get too off topic here. So that's one. So you have intrastate sectarian competition. In Pakistan, you also have an extremely high rate of urbanization. Pakistan's urbanizing at the highest rate in South Asia. For example, just to give a sense, the total population in Pakistan's top cities jumped from 23 million in 1998 to 40 million in 2017. And unsurprisingly, there's also a high population growth rate, which is in part driving urbanization as well. So Pakistan has had a history and continues to have a history of bad family planning, bad long-term family planning policy. And the country is now the fifth most populous country in the world with 207 million people. So in 1970, Pakistan had 58 million people. So that's pretty explosive population growth over that span. So those are the factors that are driving the potential for intrastate conflict, water-related intrastate conflict, and there's also water can play into interstate conflict as well. India, Kashmir being the big one, but there's also, and sort of like, India, Pakistan over Kashmir. Obviously, we saw it recently over a couple months ago. We saw how in fact, we did a podcast on it. We saw that situation can blow up. But there's also India-China considerations here, particularly because China has geographic control over the Indus headwaters and the Brahmaputra headwaters. That will be a future article because it's a different basin. And the two countries have fought a war in the past, back in the 60s, and they have a variety of territorial disputes that are unresolved. A couple of years ago, we saw one flare up in the Doklam Plateau, for example. And finally, these countries are nuclear armed, so any potential conflict is very concerning.
Now, Zac, previously in our discussion and also in the article, you talk about the timeline for the water shortage becoming a serious issue as being sometime this century. So what can we expect for the future, both in the immediate term as water levels rise and the longer term as they start to decline?
Okay, so basically, the situation that sort of frames these articles is the glacier is melting, right? So the glacier is melting, and the articles include a very good. They're informed by a very sort of in-depth article that was recently published in, I believe it was Nature and Climate Change. The links in the articles, so I encourage everyone to go and read the original article because it goes through each basin, and their different sort of rates of decline. So the issue of glacier melt itself is not a particularly alarmist issue, right? Like, it's alarming, but it's not in and of itself enough to create sort of disaster type situation within these basins. However, it is a factor that can accentuate pre-existing stressors and make a bad situation worse. So the glacier systems as they existed, they kind of modulate volume within the river system, and they insulate against seasonal or other disruptions, whether they're too much rain, too little rain, whatever, over the course of a year. As the glaciers decline and disappear, you're going to lose that modulating influence, so the droughts will be drier and the surges will be wetter. So there's that. When they're gone, the amount of volume that they create downstream again varies, but it's not like the whole river system is going to dry up or anything, right? However, as we move towards peak water, which in the case of the Indus again is 2070, so it's still a ways to go. It's obviously going to it's going to make the situation worse, right? So we need to view glacier melt within the context of all these other political and economic and human trends that are currently unfolding within the Indus. So basically, glacier melt in and of itself is not gonna be a disastrous game changer. It's something to think about more in the future in terms of the Indus. However, the Indus has been identified as one of the basins that's particularly susceptible to glacier melt in terms of downriver flow. Okay, so that's one consideration for the future. Another consideration for the future, and this one is more negative in the short and medium term, is the lack of political will to do anything about it in Pakistan. Arguably, the lack of means to do anything about it as well. So basically, the issue of a kind of holistic, national, serious approach towards the water shortages and the drawbacks in Pakistan's water system, it doesn't exist on the national level. It exists on the regional level because the regional governments, the municipalities, they need to deal with the day-to-day reality of the country's terrible water system. So, so that in that sense, we can expect more of the same, more of the problem getting worse and worse over time, because there's no serious national plan to deal with it at this present time. And also something we haven't gotten into in this podcast, but there's obviously the basin spans 3 countries, right? Ideally, you would have some sort of international, some sort of regional institution, some sort of regional regime to deal with, to manage this resource, right? Because it's a key resource for all 3 countries. However, all the way back to the Indus Water Treaties, which is about the 1960, or 1970, all the way back then, Pakistan and India And the Indus Waters Treaty only deals with Pakistan and India. It doesn't include China, or Afghanistan. But basically, it's only a bilateral treaty. It doesn't include all of the countries, and even that bilateral treaty is victim to upticks in hostilities between Islamabad and Delhi. So as we saw in the Kashmir conflict, where you had members of the Indian government who were basically threatening to pull out of the Indus water treaties and to start using much more upstream flow. So there's no regional regime to manage the Indus waters right now, and there's no reason to believe there will be one anytime soon. So that's another reason that we're probably going to see the situation get worse before it gets better. So basically, short-term negative outlook, and unless we start seeing sort of national plan in Pakistan, which is the most serious situation right now, or some sort of regional approach to managing the waters, we can expect the situation to get worse. And just one final point, the Indus Basin is not unique in the world. There are plenty of other water systems that are similarly stressed. For example, the Mekong or the Brahmaputra. And most of the factors that you see here also exist in these other examples. And, it's a case of lack of long-term national planning and a lack of regional cooperation. This is obviously a unique sort of situation where if you're the upstream country, you have full control over sort of life-giving, economically crucial resource. And that has made it difficult to sort of forge useful and effective regional regimes to control these resources. Another classic example is the Nile between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and the Grand Renaissance Dam, which we've also posted articles on in the past. But I think I am definitely past my time limit, so I think we'll call it at that. So
fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Zac. And clearly this is an important issue that will have serious consequences on regional power dynamics and politics moving forward in years and decades to come. So again, to our listeners who want to read more about this issue, you can check out the article on our website, Geopoliticalmonitor.com, and the article's title is Glacier Watch Indus Basin. And as Zac mentioned, this is the first in a series of articles on glacier melting worldwide and the geopolitical ramifications of those events. So thank you again to our listeners, and look forward to speaking next time. Talk to you then.